If you're fall asleep during this time, all you need to remember really is this page, because this is my major message from this Drash, that we should use relational eyes to prioritize. And I will explain how I got there as we continue. Here's somebody. This is Steve Martin, a very talented man. When he first appeared on the comedy scene, he wore this kind of persona. He called himself a wild and crazy guy. And he said, you know, I believe in 8 out of the 10 commandments. Well, you know, when I think of that, everybody has the same reflex. When he said that, the same reflex is, gee, I wonder which 2 he left out. And that brings a certain amount of laughter. But we too pick and choose in the doing of commandments. We choose which ones we think are more important. Let me just talk, by the way, I'm not talking about ritual commands. I'm talking only about ethical and moral commands. We still choose amongst these. We give them different kinds of weight, but I want to challenge us to examine if that is really a very good thing to do, if it really accords with the way God operates. I think you will find that it's not in accord with the way God operates at all, that we may be giving commandments short shrift that God takes very seriously. So let's look at this, and remember our goal today is to learn how to use relational eyes to prioritize, and that will become clearer to us as we go on. Tonight's roadmap is, I'm going to go in 3 sections here. First, I'm going to take a look at 3 figures in the Haftorah from last Shabbat, 3 figures that appear in there. Secondly, I'm going to look at 7 sins that are mentioned in one of the verses in that Haftorah. And then I'm going to look at 3 principles to help us to use relational eyes to prioritize. So there's the roadmap. That's what we're going to do right now. Let's begin by looking at these 3 figures that appear in the book of Malachi. The first figure is, just a second, I want to make sure we are in the right, there we are. The first figure is the preparing messenger. He appears right there at the beginning of chapter 3, and it says, look, I am sending my messenger to clear the way before me. Other translations say to prepare the way before me. Let's look at that again. Look, I'm sending my messenger to prepare the way before me. What is this? Well, in the ancient world, the roads were dirt roads in many cases. The Romans came and built roads that some of them are still traceable today. That was one of the wonders of the Roman Empire, their roads. But generally, in the ancient world, the roads were very uneven. And when a king was going to come and visit you, or another dignitary, the people of the village, of the city, would go out and they'd fill in what we would call potholes. They would fill in the potholes. They'd remove the big boulders or rocks, because the king was coming probably in a sedan chair. And if people had to walk into holes and out of holes and over rocks, it would be a very bumpy ride. So they would go out there and prepare the way for the king. And that's what Malachi is talking about in terms of the preparing messenger. He is preparing the way for the king to visit with us. And the second paragraph here is a parallel consideration from the book of Isaiah that talks about the same metaphor. And these 2 passages, of course, are brought back to back together in the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament. This verse says, clear a road through the desert for Adonai, level a highway in the Aravah for our God, because he's the king. He's coming, and we need to clear the road, level the highway, let every valley be lifted up, So that's at one level. Let every mountain and hill be lowered down to the same level, and the bumpy places made level, and the crags become a plain. So this is all about preparing for the coming of a king. That's the first figure in the book of Malachi. There are three. The second figure is who I call the purifying messenger, because Malachi goes on to say, the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. So here's the king coming. He's the Lord whom you seek. Yes, and he refers to him as the messenger of the covenant in whom you take such delight. Now this is kind of tricky, except if we remember the triunity of God, that God can speak of in this way. And he says, yes, he's the messenger of the covenant. He reminds Israel of their covenant responsibilities. That's what a messenger of the covenant would do. Look, he comes, says Adonai Tzavot. But who can endure the day of his coming? He's a purifying messenger. Who can stand when he appears? For he will be like a refiner's fire, like the soap maker's lie. He will sit testing, and here comes purifying again, 4 times in this passage, purifying is mentioned. He will sit testing and purifying the silver. He will purify the sons of Levi, refining them like gold and silver, so that they can bring offerings to God uprightly. And of course, the whole book of Malachi is about the sons of Levi and the priests who had gotten so ho-hum about service to God. They were so done with it. They were so bored. It was such a trial to them. God is highly insulted, but he says he's going to send a purifying messenger who's going to deal with the sons of Levi and purify their attitudes. Now, of course, when Yeshua came, he is the purifying messenger. When he came, he dealt largely with the Sadducees, and he dealt with the priestly class. Then we read about another prisoner, another figure, and that is the potentate judge. We have the announcing messenger, the preparing messenger. We have the purifying messenger, and then we have the potentate, the judge, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, who comes. And then we have this passage about commandments that he mentions in Malachi. And there are 7 sins that are mentioned here. Then I will approach you for judgment against sorcerers, 1, adulterers, perjurers, those who take advantage of the wage earners, widows and orphans, and those who rob the foreigner of his rights and don't fear me, says Adonai Tzavot. The judge of all the earth is coming to judge for these sins. Now look at them again. 7 of them. And I would ask you, I think most of us would say that these sins do not look equivalent to us. Some of these sins we take more seriously than others. Certainly, sorcery, dealing with black magic and satanic power, that's a no-no. And adultery, yes, that should be a no-no too. Swearing falsely in court, that happens. Oppressing the widow, taking financial advantage of powerless people, oppressing the widow, oppressing the fatherless, cheating the wage earner. Does that happen in our day? Does cheating the wage earner, getting that ripping people off and not paying them what they're really worth, does that happen in our day? It certainly does. Do people take it as seriously as they would sorcery or adultery? Well, depends who you ask. And this last one, denying justice to the foreigner, the stranger among us. I find in our day that there's quite a bit of hostility to the poor, which is what you're dealing with when you deal with the widow, the fatherless, and the wage earner, and also the stranger. there's a lot of hostility to the poor in our day. People will say, look, let them get a job. We don't want them sponging off of us. Let them get a job like everybody else. It's not always that easy. But there's a certain reflexive hostility. And also to the foreigner at our borders, there's a kind of a blanket hostility. And it's justified by the fact that these people are not legal. We need to remember that they're still people, and they're not all drug dealers, rapists, and thugs, as some people say. So my point here is that we can look at a set of sins like this, and we reflexively rank them. But does God reflexively rank them? Let's look a little further. God's priorities are not like ours. I want to mention three voices. Samuel says, man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart. Isaiah says, my thoughts are not like your thoughts, nor my ways like your ways. So God says, I'm not like you. Don't think that the way you think is the way I think. Don't think that the way you act is the way I act. And then Asaph, the head of one of the guilds of the musicians in the temple, in Psalm 50, he says this, for God, he says, you thought I was just like you, but I'll rebuke you and lay out the case before you. God says these stern words. You reflexively think that I'm like you, but I'm not. So we have to be careful about our tendency to rank sins as terrible, pretty bad, and boys will be boys. Yeshua gives us principles for us to act with relationship eyes. He gives three principles that help us to wade through how we deal with ethical concerns in our day-to-day life, knowing that we may not reflexively rank sins the same way God does. Yeshua gives us a lot of help here in three statements. First, he says, don't major in the minors. In Matthew 23, he says, you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and you neglect the weightier matters of the law. He's saying, don't major in the minors. You tithe. Imagine if you were a person who every year decides to give to God 1/10 of all the salt you've used or all the pepper you've used during the year. That's a real attention to detail. That's a focus on detail. He says, don't major in the minors. He mentions elsewhere, you are people who strain out the gnat and you swallow the camel. You're so preoccupied with minutia that you miss the big things. That brings us to the second principle. Yeshua calls these the weightier matters of Torah. Now, he says what the weightier matters of Torah are. He says, you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and neglect the weightier matters of the Torah, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. That's the weightier stuff. Those are the things that we need to concentrate on justice for all, mercy for all, and faithfulness to all with whom we are in relationship. The prophet Micah puts it this way, what does the Lord require of you but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? That's the second consideration. That's the weightier matters of Torah. That gives us direction in choosing our ethical decisions. And the final one is the most helpful of all. Yeshua speaks of two commandments upon which everything else pivots. These are not just the biggest of the big. These are not simply the top of the list. They are the commandments upon which everything else pivots. And that is to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, and mind, and with all of our strength. That love is not talking about our feelings. It's talking about our choices. Being faithful in our choices to God. Loving the Lord our God. Choosing to obey him with all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our mind, all of our strength. And the second is like it, You shall love your neighbor as yourself. You shall make choices that benefit your neighbor just as you would make choices to benefit yourself. Those are the three principles from Yeshua that help us to make right ethical choices. Now, Yeshua had relational eyes to prioritize, which is what we're talking about, of course, having relational eyes to prioritize. Yeshua had these kind of eyes. He cultivated this kind of vision. How do we know this? In Luke chapter 4, when he inaugurates his messianic career, he picks up the scroll and he reads from the prophet Isaiah, "The Spirit of Adonai is upon me. Therefore, he has anointed me to do what? To announce good news to the poor." There's the poor again. Yeshua makes them first in his consideration. Good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the imprisoned and renewed sight for the blind. This is all intensely relational. To release those who have been crushed and to proclaim a year of the favor of Adonai. This year of the favor of Adonai is the Jubilee year. Every 50 years in Israel under the monarchy, every 50 years, all debts would be canceled. Because people who got into financial trouble in some way or another would often they would turn their ancestral lands over to the person to whom they are indebted, or they'd go into indentured servitude, a form of slavery, to pay off their debts. But every 50 years, all bets were off. Everything went back. People, in other words, every 50 years, everybody had a new start. That's extraordinary. Everybody has a reset every 50 years. So Yeshua says that what the Spirit is up to in his ministry is that he should preach good news to the poor, proclaim freedom to the imprisoned, renewed sight to the blind, release those who have been crushed, to proclaim a new start for everybody. That's about as relational as it gets. So this whole message, based upon what we read in Malachi, is telling us to use relational eyes to prioritize. When you go, and I know that we have such great people in this group, so I know I'm preaching to the choir here, that when you go to work, when you go through your neighborhood, wherever you encounter people, I know that God has already given you eyes to see people who are in trouble, to see people who seem to be hurting, to see people with relational eyes who need a touch of mercy, grace, and hope. I want to encourage you in always using relational eyes to prioritize your life, because from everything the Bible says, God cares about these things pretty much above all else. So may he be with us as we use relational eyes to prioritize. Happy Passover, and God bless you.